Ireland is officially the richest country in Europe. Per capita GDP higher than Germany, France, even Luxembourg. A median Dublin apartment costs nearly €500,000. But here's what the statistics don't tell you. Irish economists had to invent an entirely new economic measure because their own GDP became, in their words, meaningless. When Nobel laureate Paul Krugman saw Ireland's numbers, he had one reaction. He called it Leprechaun economics. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a country can be statistically rich and functionally broke, and why it matters for your own economy. And if you think this is just Ireland's problem, think again, because what happens in Dublin doesn't stay in Dublin. In September 2024, the European Court of Justice ruled Ireland must collect €14 billion from Apple, the largest corporate tax fine in history. In January 2024, a global minimum tax of 15% went into effect, threatening Ireland's signature 12.5% rate. And right now, just 3 companies, likely Google, Apple, and Microsoft, account for 38 to 43% of Ireland's entire corporate tax revenue. This isn't just an Irish story. It's the story of how a small country became the world's largest corporate tax haven, larger than the entire Caribbean system combined, and what happens when that model starts to crack. The OECD estimates profit-shifting costs governments $100 to $240 billion annually. Ireland sits at the center of that machine. If you invest in tech stocks, own European ETFs, or pay taxes in any developed nation, Ireland's house of cards affects your money. But Ireland didn't become a tax haven by accident. It was a deliberate strategy, born from desperation, in a country so poor that a quarter of its people fled. In 1959, Ireland was an economic disaster. Unemployment exceeded 15%. A quarter of the population emigrated in a single decade. Young Irish fleeing to the UK, the US, Australia. Ireland was the sick man of Europe. But at Shannon Airport, a visionary named Brendan O'Regan had an idea. What if Ireland offered something no other European country would? 0 taxes on export profits for 25 years. The Shannon Free Zone became the world's first modern free trade zone, the template that China would copy for Shenzhen 2 decades later. A Chinese delegation literally visited Shannon in 1980 to study how it worked. By 1968, the zone employed nearly 4,000 people. Over 100 countries eventually copied the model. Through the 70s and 80s, Ireland's Industrial Development Authority became a corporate headhunting machine. They didn't wait for companies to come to them, they went hunting. The wins started stacking up. Pfizer in 1969, Apple in 1980, Microsoft in 1985, Intel in 1989. In 1987, Taoiseach Charles Haughey created the Dublin International Financial Services Centre after meeting billionaire financier Dermot Desmond in New York. The IFSC would become the beating heart of Ireland's tax haven model. Then came the masterstroke. In 1997, Finance Minister Ruairí Quinn announced a 12.5% corporate tax rate. By 2003, it was fully implemented, the lowest rate in Western Europe. The results were staggering. GDP growth averaged 9.4% per year from 1995 to 2007. Unemployment fell from 17% in 1987 to under 4% by 2001. Ireland's GDP per capita overtook the UK in 1997. For the first time in modern history, Ireland transformed from a country of emigration to a country of immigration. People were coming to Ireland. The Celtic tiger was purring. Ireland was the success story of Europe. And then, 2008 happened. Ireland was the first Eurozone country to enter recession. The bank bailout cost €64 billion. 30% of GDP, gone. On November 21st, 2010, Taoiseach Brian Cowan made a phone call no Irish leader ever wanted to make. He requested an EU and IMF bailout, 85 billion euros. National humiliation. Sovereignty effectively handed to the Troika. But here's the critical moment. Under intense EU pressure during that bailout, Ireland refused to raise the 12.5% rate. The multinationals had become too important to risk losing. Ireland was locked in. But here's what most people don't understand about Ireland. The 12.5% rate? That's a distraction. The real rate paid by Apple? According to EU investigators, 0.005%. That's $50 on a million in profits. And it was all completely legal under Irish law. The structure that made it possible had a name that sounds like a drink order: the Double Irish with a Dutch sandwich. To understand how this worked, you need to follow the money through 3 countries and 2 companies that existed only on paper. Step 1. A U.S. parent company creates intellectual property in America: patents, software, trademarks. Step 2. Those IP rights get transferred to an Irish company. Let's call it Ireland One. Now here's the loophole. Ireland One is incorporated in Ireland, but it's managed and controlled from Bermuda. Step 3. This is where it gets beautiful. Irish law taxed companies based on where they were managed. U.S. law taxed companies based on where they were incorporated. Ireland One fell between both systems. It was stateless, a corporate ghost that belonged to no country for tax purposes. Step 4. A second Irish company, Ireland Two, gets established. This one is actually managed in Ireland, so it's an Irish tax resident. Step 5. Ireland Two conducts the sales. It collects revenue from customers worldwide. Step 6. Ireland Two pays a massive royalty to Ireland One for the right to use that intellectual property. These royalties are tax-deductible. They reduce Ireland Two's taxable profits to near zero. Step 7. Ireland One accumulates all those profits in Bermuda, untaxed. And the best part? The accountants who designed this weren't hiding in the shadows. They were celebrated. The grand architect was Fergal O'Rourke, a PwC tax partner in Dublin, son of a government minister, cousin of a finance minister. By 2010, the Double Irish was shielding $100 billion annually in U.S. multinational profits. It built roughly $1 trillion in untaxed offshore reserves between 2004 and 2018. One tax structure, $1 trillion, the largest tax avoidance tool in history. Still with me? Good, because we haven't even gotten to the Dutch sandwich yet. There was a problem with the Double Irish. Irish withholding tax applied to payments going directly to non-EU tax havens like Bermuda. The solution? Insert a Dutch company in the middle. The EU's Interest and Royalties Directive meant payments between EU members were exempt from withholding tax, and the Netherlands charged zero withholding tax on outbound royalties. So profits flowed like this: customer to Ireland Two, Ireland Two to Netherlands, Netherlands to Ireland One, Ireland One to Bermuda, accumulate tax-free. The Netherlands became the world's largest conduit for offshore corporate investment. 23% of all global flows passed through. It gets even more creative. Irish subsidiaries would contract manufacturing to Asian factories. Products never physically touched Ireland, but the Irish company retained ownership throughout production. Profits got recorded in Ireland even though manufacturing happened in China. Irish exports included products made entirely overseas. Statistics became meaningless. On October 14, 2014, Finance Minister Michael Noonan announced the double Irish would close. No new structures allowed after January 2015. Existing users grandfathered until 2020. Problem solved, right? Wrong. IP tax breaks claimed jumped 1,000%, from 2.7 billion euros in 2014 to 26.2 billion in 2015. Companies rushed to onshore their intellectual property before the door closed, using new tools that achieved the same result. The replacement structures, capital allowances for intangible assets, the knowledge development box, can still achieve 0 to 2.5% effective rates. The name changed, the game didn't. Here's the simplest way to understand this. Imagine your roommate's income showing up on your bank statement. You look rich on paper, but you still can't afford rent. That's Ireland's GDP. GDP measures all economic activity within borders, including foreign companies' profits. GNI subtracts income flowing to foreigners. But even that wasn't enough for Ireland. In February 2017, the central bank created GNI Star, a custom measure that further excluded IP depreciation, aircraft leasing, and re-domiciled companies. The reason? Irish GDP had become, in their words, meaningless for policy planning. Here's the gap. In 2024, Ireland's GDP was 562.8 billion euros. Its GNI Star, 321.1 billion, a gap of 241.7 billion euros. GDP is 75% larger than the actual economy. Former central bank Governor Patrick Honohan put it bluntly, the statistical distortions have now become so large as to make a mockery of conventional uses of Irish GDP. Let that sink in. A country's own central banker calling their official statistics a mockery. But all of this was theoretical. Accounting flows, legal structures, abstract billions. Then, on July 12, 2016, at 11 a.m., Ireland's Statistical Office released its 2015 GDP figures. The economy had grown not by 3%, not by 10%, but by 26.3% in a single year. For a developed Western nation, this was unprecedented. Within 24 minutes, Nobel laureate Paul Krugman was on Twitter with a new phrase for economics textbooks: Leprechaun economics. The world laughed. The EU audited. But the numbers were technically correct. One company had done something that added more to Ireland's GDP than the entire value of Irish residential property. In the first quarter of 2015, Apple closed its hybrid double Irish structure. The EU Commission had opened a formal investigation in June 2014. Apple needed to restructure. The solution? Switch to capital allowances for intangible assets and transfer $300 billion in intellectual property from Apple's Jersey subsidiary to its Irish subsidiary. $300 billion. The largest base erosion and profit-shifting transaction in history. This IP value exceeded the entire value of residential property in Ireland. That's why GDP spiked 26%. Apple's accountants moved numbers on a spreadsheet. Ireland's economy statistically exploded. The Financial Times called the figures a work of Irish fiction that would reinforce Irish cynicism about its much-touted recovery. The Wall Street Journal said figures shouldn't be taken at face value. Irish economist Jim Power was more direct. It's meaningless. We would be laughing if these numbers came out of China. Eurostat audited Irish statistics in October 2016. They found no irregularities. Ireland had followed all the rules correctly, which revealed that the rules themselves were the problem. By 2018, economist Gabriel Zucman concluded Ireland was the world's largest corporate tax haven, larger than the entire Caribbean system combined. Oh, and by the way, Ireland's inflated GDP directly increased their EU budget contribution by €380 million per year. They're literally paying to look richer than they are. Now here's where it gets dangerous. Corporate tax from the top 10 companies? 57% of all receipts. Top 3 companies? 38 to 43%, and rising. Corporate tax from foreign multinationals? 88%. From U.S. multinationals specifically? 75 to 78%. In 2014, Ireland collected $4.6 billion in corporate tax. In 2024, $39.1 billion, including the Apple payment, a six-fold increase in a decade. The Irish Fiscal Advisory Council warns just 3 companies account for most of the windfalls. Receipts could easily disappear if a handful of multinationals experience sudden shifts in fortunes. The Irish Small and Medium Enterprise Association is blunter. Government is sleepwalking into economic peril. Hey, quick question for the comments. If you were an Irish worker earning the median salary, would you stay and fight for housing reform or emigrate like over 1 million others have done? Let me know below. But here's where it gets personal for ordinary Irish people. The national median weekly earnings? €730, about 38,000 a year. But in the tech sector? €1,440 weekly, 75,000 a year. And 44% of tech workers earn over 83,000. Now look at the housing market. Dublin average rent? €2,540 a month, up from €765 in 2011. Dublin median property price? €495,000. Do the math. A median Irish worker would need to spend nearly their entire salary on rent alone. And there are now over 16,700 homeless people in Ireland, a record high, up 12% year over year. Economist David McWilliams explained it in January 2026. The billions of euro flowing into the country from American multinationals is driving inflation. Most of this new money reappears in the economy as higher prices, driving an affordability crisis. The Leprechaun's gold inflated everything. So why not just fix it? Foreign multinationals employ over 300,000 people directly, 11% of national employment. Another 169,000 jobs depend on them indirectly. But here's what the IMF found. Productivity spillovers to the indigenous economy are limited. The domestic sector remains far away from technology frontiers. GNI star as a percentage of GDP has fallen from 72% in 2012 to just 54% in 2023. The gap is widening, not closing. Why won't easy solutions work? Just raise taxes? Ireland already agreed to the 15% global minimum. But paradoxically, Pillar 2 will increase increase concentration. Only the largest companies can absorb higher rates. Smaller ones leave. Diversify the economy? Decades of tax haven economics have crowded out domestic industry. There are very few large-scale indigenous Irish success stories. Ryanair is the notable exception. Force change through the EU? Ireland has veto power on EU tax harmonization, and other EU members, Luxembourg, Netherlands, are also tax havens. They're not rushing to change either. The trap has no exit. For decades, critics predicted this model would collapse. Ireland's response? You can't touch our tax rate. Then, in 2021, the world called their bluff. In July 2021, Ireland initially refused to join the OECD's Global Minimum Tax Agreement. They specifically objected to the phrase, at least 15%. But on October 7th, after the OECD removed those two words, the Irish cabinet reversed position. The next day, Ireland officially joined 136 jurisdictions. Finance Minister Paschal Donohoe called it a difficult and complex decision, but the right one. He acknowledged potential costs of up to €2 billion in foregone receipts. The 12.5% rate remains for 95% of companies, those under the €750 million threshold, about 160,000 businesses. But the roughly 1,600 large multinationals that drive Ireland's model, they now face the 15% minimum. And then there's Apple. In August 2016, the EU Commission ruled Ireland had given Apple €13 billion in illegal state aid. Ireland appealed and won in 2020. But on September 10, 2024, the European Court of Justice reversed that decision. Final amount? €14.3 billion. Here's the irony. Ireland opposed receiving €14 billion. They argued it would damage their reputation as a reliable tax jurisdiction. The government spent 8 years and millions in legal fees fighting to not receive the money. The Irish government knows the truth. Official warnings call corporate tax receipts volatile and unsustainable for long-term planning. The Fiscal Advisory Council repeatedly warns of over-reliance. Yet spending continues as if the money will flow forever. The harsh reality? Ireland fought for independence from Britain for centuries. Now, its economic sovereignty depends on decisions made in boardrooms in Cupertino, Mountain View, and Redmond. The richest country in Europe can't control its own destiny. Ireland now faces an unprecedented situation. Budget surpluses, billions in windfall taxes, and a model that might be ending. What happens next? Now, before we write Ireland off completely, let's be honest about something. The critics have been predicting collapse for decades, and it hasn't happened. The benefits are real. 302,000 direct jobs in multinationals. These are real people, not accounting entries. Corporate tax revenue hit €32.9 billion in 2025, among the highest per capita in Europe. Budget surplus of €21.9 billion in 2024. Unemployment at 4.2%, near full employment. Irish economist Seamus Coffey, former chair of the Fiscal Council, puts it this way. Meant to be a target of global tax reform, Ireland has instead been a big beneficiary. The changes over the past decade have seen no reduction in the flow of investment and creation of employment here. He's not wrong. Living standards genuinely transformed. Ireland overtook the UK in per capita income back in 1997. And despite everything we've discussed, companies keep coming. So what happens next? Best case? Successful pivot. Ireland transitions to a genuine knowledge economy. Pillar 2 actually increases tax revenue. The Fiscal Advisory Council projects $3 to $5 billion extra annually from 2026. The Future Ireland Fund reaches €100 billion by 2035. AI, semiconductors, green energy become new growth drivers. Worst case? Sudden shock. The top 3 companies restructure or relocate. 38 to 43% of corporate tax vanishes overnight. Without windfalls, Ireland faces 5 to 6 billion in annual deficits. Property market crashes. Third bailout in 15 years. Most likely, gradual erosion. Slow reduction in competitive advantage as the global minimum tax reduces differentiation. Corporate tax stabilizes but stops growing. Ireland becomes a normal European economy, comfortable but no longer exceptional. Painful adjustment over 10 to 20 years. In any scenario, multinationals win. They'll find the next tax haven. Tax lawyers and accountants win. They're always in demand. The losers? Irish workers dependent on multinational jobs. Irish taxpayers facing service cuts. Irish homeowners if the property market crashes again. And here's what matters for you, wherever you're watching from. GDP is a terrible measure of actual prosperity. Economic miracles often hide structural weaknesses. Tax competition is a race to the bottom where everyone loses except corporations. And your own country may be playing similar games. Remember that €495,000 Dublin apartment we mentioned at the start? Now you know why ordinary Irish workers earning $38,000 a year can't afford it. The Leprechaun's gold inflated everything. Ireland's GDP, €562.8 billion. Ireland's actual economy, €321.1 billion. The gap, €241.7 billion. Wealth that exists on paper flows through Ireland, but never stays. Ireland's story isn't unique. It's just the most extreme example of a global system where corporations play countries against each other. The Leprechaun's gold was always an illusion. The question is, what happens when everyone finally realizes the pot is empty? And if you haven't seen our deep dive into Italy's debt crisis, another European economy trapped by forces beyond its control, check it out. Links on screen. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop your prediction in the comments. Does Ireland successfully pivot to a real economy? Or does the house of cards finally collapse?